What is the Bible?
I love this question because when I first read your email, I even had to sort of stop and ponder and think, what is the Bible? This is what I do for a living. I teach the Bible. And I think the reason why you sort of have to pause and ponder that question is because it's actually not a straightforward answer.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we seek to elevate the conversation about the things that matter, or should matter, deeply human questions about meaning, purpose, and hope. No matter what you believe, we hope you'll join us exploring the complexities, the struggles, and the joys of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. Did you know that the biggest selling book of all time is the Bible? And not just historically, the Bible continues to sell in astonishing numbers. According to the United Bible Societies, the annual print run of Bibles is 80 million. And 2024 saw a 22% rise in Bible sales. There are various theories as to why that is. Global uncertainty, and possibly a post-secular environment where people are searching for meaning and purpose and spiritual nourishment they're not getting elsewhere. It's still the case that Western countries like Australia are highly secular, and while the Bible might be easily accessible in these places, the levels of knowledge or interest in the Bible are very low. Might that be changing though? Today we have a deep dive into the Bible. What is it? How is it put together? What kind of influence has it had on our lives, even if we're not Bible readers ourselves? We're going to look at this from a few angles today. And to kick us off, we have our friend and former colleague, Dr. Greg Clark, back in the CPX studio. Greg is, of course, a co-founder of CPX. He was the CEO of the Bible Society and also the author of The Great Bible Swindle. These days, Greg is the CEO of Leprosy Mission Australia. Greg, so good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
It is so great to be here and be talking to you again.
Thanks for being here. I want to talk to you about the influence of the Bible on our culture, which has been profound. But let's start at the maybe more trivial end of things with popular sayings that most of us use perhaps without even knowing that they come from the Bible. There's plenty of them, aren't there?
Look, there's so many. They say the English language, it's formed by Shakespeare and the Bible. And England gave us Shakespeare, but the Bible gave us England. And, it's kind of gone from England to the English-speaking world and influenced just so much of our language across probably the last at least 500 years, we could say. So many phrases we use are just biblical phrases like cast the first stone, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In fact, I love that one particularly because, Moses in the book of Leviticus in the Bible, he talks about revenge and so forth as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But then I love it when you get to the New Testament of the Bible and Jesus kind of radicalizes that idea and he says, well, that's justice, but what about we turn the other cheek? That's mercy. And we still use both those phrases in our Australian English all the time.
Yes.
Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Get the guy back on the footy field if he tackled you hard, but turn the other cheek whenever you want to be merciful and kind.
Yeah, things like lamb to the slaughter, I think. The salt of the earth, the sign of the times. There's tons of these.
There's so many. In fact, the idioms of English draw themselves mainly from the Bible. And this goes back to, I guess, the time of the development of the Bible in English and the incredible influence that those early translators had because they were very literary people. Like William Tyndale is my great example. He was translating the Bible in the 1520s, 1530s. And I would say his work on the Bible is the single most influential text on the English language. Because even the King James Bible, which came a little bit later in 1611, it was written by a committee of about 50 people, but 80+% of it is still the language that Tyndale came up with, the language he used. So, from those origins sort of, 500 years ago, we still get the language we use today. And there are lots of other influences on English language, but the kind of bedrock of it is still this language from those early English translations of the Bible.
And of course, he was risking his life by doing this. So does that element of this add something of the urgency, the drama of what we were experiencing?
He did it because he thought everyone should have a chance to read the Word of God. And he understood the Bible as the Word of God. And his role was to ensure that the average person, they talk about the ploughman in the field as the person who should be able to read the Word of God. And so the kind of language that those early kind of reforming type people came up with was the language of the people. Yeah. So they wanted to use metaphors that related to agriculture, farming, livestock, trade, all the kind of everyday things that people would talk about. So salt of the earth, they understood, well, the salt's the thing that preserves things. So you're the salt of the earth. You're a great guy. You're part of the furniture. You're salt of the earth. That's a very earthy, down to earth. It's a very working kind of metaphor. It wasn't something only the priests would understand.
Yeah, so it wasn't just that they could get this thing and have some understanding of it, but it spoke to their lives in really powerful ways.
And it was really honest to the biblical text itself. So the Hebrew scriptures that Christians call the Old Testament, it's full of stories of people in farming situations, nomads, builders, artists, musicians. Only parts of it are about the kings and the royals, and it's actually a book of the people. So they wanted to reflect that in the English language, and I think did a great job of it. And you get to the New Testament where Jesus is one who's actually often speaking out against the authorities of the day, whether they're church authorities or political authorities. So he also appeals to the language of the people using things like parables, storytelling, things people really understood immediately.
Spiritual text, but with a very earthy feel to it.
That's a great summary.
Now, I want to talk to you about literature and the stories of our culture that are familiar to us. I've got a friend who says that all stories emerge in some respect from the story of Cain and Abel from Genesis. The murder of a man by his brother who spends the rest of his life dealing with that
Is that person a fan of true crime, perhaps?
Guilt. He could be. His blood cries out to me from the ground, God says. But there's an element of what he says here that I think you would connect with, which is these sort of theological themes in our literature and the influence of the Bible there.
Yes, they talk about the mark of Cain. Like Cain, the first murderer, left his mark, and he left his mark on storytelling as well, because the story of Cain and Abel, you've got to go back to the book of Genesis to read it. It's about jealousy. It's about inheritance. It's about family it's like Succession. It's an early version of Succession.
Rifts.
It's rifts in the family. So these kind of stories you get in the early, especially in the first sort of 4 or 5 books of the Bible, are very formative for the way we tell stories in Western culture in particular. Not just Western culture, but that's the culture I know the best. They form kind of what the scholars call an text, which is like, what's the text that all the other texts look back to form their shape? And so you're right, Cain and Abel becomes the story of murder, the sort of base kind of story of how a murder is played out. And there's a book like East of Eden by John Steinbeck, the American writer, which builds on that, So those elements of plot are one thing. Then the other part I think that's extremely important is the languages we've discussed. And then the morality and theology of Scripture also kind of shapes storytelling up until about the middle of the 20th century.
Yes.
And then things start to change. So during that period where the English Bible was becoming popular, 1600s and up to the 1900s, you're getting the kind of stories that are told informed by the morality of the Bible, informed by the theology of the Bible. Right and wrong are measured against the Bible's view of right and wrong.
Yes.
Then things change, because in the middle of the 20th century, we had World War II, 2 World Wars, horrific events that really led a lot of people to question their faith, question the idea that a good God could allow a world like this. And you start to see that reflected in the literature, the storytelling, the movies that arise after that, and the music as well. And the interesting thing about that to me, and that's my area of study, 20th century literature, is it's not like Christianity gets chucked out the window. It's not like the Bible gets abandoned. It becomes a boxing partner instead of a kind of companion.
Yep.
And so writers like, say, Irish writer Samuel Beckett, existentialist, novelist and playwright, his work is just strewn with Scripture, but it's in a combative mode.
Yep.
It's in like, can we believe it? And I love this scene from Waiting for Godot, is probably his most famous play, where one of the characters is sort of sitting there musing on the meaning of life. And if anyone knows the play, it's a depressingly kind of bleak play about meaninglessness. And he muses, and then he just says out of the blue, one of the thieves was saved. It's a reasonable percentage. And you go, okay, what's that all about? You know, and if you don't know the gospel story of Jesus being crucified with two thieves, one on either side of him, and one of them saying to him, take us down from here, you're meant to be the Son of God, what are you doing? And the other one saying, please receive me into your kingdom, I humble myself before you. One of the thieves was saved, one of the thieves was damned. If you don't know that story, you have no idea what Beckett's talking about. Yeah. But when you do, it's incredibly potent that he's thinking, well, I've got a chance at least. I've got a chance maybe that I'll be saved. One of the thieves made it through. So, you know, the kind of ripples and
there are
echoes.
references here, aren't there? So that without some sort of knowledge of the Bible, you're going to be completely lost. So that goes from Shakespeare all the way through Dickens and so on.
All of English literature up until the 20th century, and then it starts to diversify. But still in a lot of it, you're going to find the trails and echoes and ghosts of the Bible all the way through, right up to today. And they usually are poignant parts of the story, not just trivial parts of the story. Yeah. Sometimes they are. Take a writer like Marilyn Robinson, who I know you love. Yeah. The context of her writing is within the Christian community of the southern states of America and family life. And so everything people talk about and know is still kind of imbued with biblical thinking. It's a rich part of the story, not just a trivial part.
Even things like, this is a lion's den moment for me. Again, you need to know the story, don't you?
Well, you and I both love rugby league, and we still hear it out of the mouths of commentators, even though they mangle it sometimes. I've heard so many rugby players just saying, you know, oh, he's back from the dead, or
it's a thief, or like a thief in the night.
Like a thief in the night.
Ray Warren used to like saying.
Right. Yeah, and they're all built on the whatever kind of memory they have of the Bible stories they either heard at Sunday school, or maybe they're still reading the scriptures. We don't know. But it sticks there, and I think that's partly to do with the power of the language from Tyndale and the KJV and others. And it's partly to do with when you hear the stories of the Bible, you get really struck by them. It's hard to move on from them. I always think of a phrase from the band The Cure, me being a kind of still 1980s tragic, 80s. Where Robert Smith talks about, he says, I'm paralysed by the blood of Christ. And though it clouds my eyes, I can never stop. And I always think of that as a kind of reference to the ongoing power of the Bible story, even though you might try to run away from it.
Someone like Nick Cave, the Australian musician too,
Great example.
I feel like haunted by the Bible.
Yeah, and a fascinating example of someone who's sort of circling around to a positive view of religion, Christianity and the Bible in particular, the older he gets, which is sort of against the grain of what people think happens in life.
And really born out of great tragedy in his own life and experience. I want to ask you a bit more about this. The great themes of literature, they always seem to be theological in nature to me in some sense, in that they're dealing with ultimate questions of meaning and significance and things like guilt and forgiveness and what it means to be human. Do you think that's right?
Yes, and to put that sort of technically, I would say that the shape of literature and storytelling is what theologians call eschatological. It means that eschatology is, where are we going? What's the final destination? What are we heading for? How is justice going to be done? What happens after death? All those sort of questions, they get wrapped up in this term eschatology. What's the final things? What are the last things? And stories take that shape as well. So a crime story, for example, you mentioned earlier, it starts usually with, say, a murder. Something's gone wrong. Can we solve what happened? We want to know what happened. And then can we bring about justice?
Yeah, restitution.
Can we do restitution? Or can we at least bring the person who did the wrong thing to justice? And that's an eschatological story. That's sort of a long shaping of we've got to somehow redeem this situation. And then other stories, you know, use different theological terms or different theological ideas. The prodigal son is another great example. That story of Jesus where one son is totally profligate, he takes his inheritance and
spends it on wine, women and song.
Exactly. And then he comes back to the Father and repents, And that story, that shape of that story gets repeated through all sorts of literature. I think of someone we know, a local writer, Scott Monk, who wrote a story for kids called Roar, which is a story of a young child going through exactly that prodigal son story. So that's an Australian example. But Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov, is about that kind of how can we get back the person who's been lost. Even someone like James Joyce, who's a modern writer and really at odds with the church, he wrote an early story called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is about exactly this. How can a writer come back to a sense of his true self? He subverted the prodigal son story to turn it into a way of self-discovery and liberation from religion, but he still had to use the prodigal son shape to do it.
Yeah.
So those shapes of theology inform the shape of literature and culture.
What about the impact of the Bible, even more broadly than any of that? For instance, in the way we even understand what it is to be human and other such grand things.
Yeah, well, I think because a lot of the Bible is narratives that involve characters, we reflect on those characters as we read them and as we write other stories. So when someone writes a story with a Moses character in it, it's usually about someone who was given the duty of rescuing people from a terrible situation to try and take them somewhere better. So it's like from slavery to the promised land.
Yeah.
Moses kind of represents that challenge for a person. And so in your life, you may have a challenge to get out of a terrible domestic violence situation or something and take you to somewhere where there's peace. So your own story can be shaped by that kind of way of thinking about Moses.
Sort of a motif, is it?
Yeah,
is that
the mosaic motif, as they would say. The most famous one of those is Martin Luther King thought about himself as a Moses figure taking the kind of enslaved black Americans into the promised land, as he called it, the land of freedom and equality and justice. So the characters of the Bible inform how we think we should live as characters, and sometimes they inform how we think we shouldn't live if that character is a Judas character, for example. I don't want to be a Judas because Judas is the betrayer of Jesus, and so I'm not going to be a betrayer. So you see, we still use all of those biblical characters, many of them historical figures, in order to shape our own thinking about what it means to be a human being.
Good Samaritan's a good example of that, a parable of Jesus. But
yes,
everyone understands both the failure of some of the characters in that story to do what was right and the beauty of the Samaritan enacting the way he was said to act.
And even written into the law in some lands, the Good Samaritan, where you are obliged to help someone in need if you are near them at the time, drawing back to how the Samaritan saw the person who'd been beaten up on the road. And also informed the final scene of Seinfeld, just to go back to our 80s, 90s kind of...
Yes,
they were being judged for not being good Samaritans.
Yes.
Yeah, which I found startling. That there's a lot of Jewish writers on that show. They probably were familiar with biblical stories and Christian writers as well. But, amazing how those sorts of characters sit large in our imagination. They start to take up a lot of space when you're thinking about what it means to be a good person, how to avoid doing the wrong thing. These are reference points in literature that we still haven't escaped from.
So, Greg, why should people read the Bible?
Well, it's the big question, I guess, for anyone who wants to take seriously being educated in the world that we live in. If what the things we've been talking about are true, if the Bible does sort of sit like a river underneath so much of our culture, then we ought to be informed about that. Some people have been informed through their own families or their churches or their school upbringing, but a lot of people these days haven't had that opportunity. Fortunately, we live in a time where it's easier than ever to get hold of a Bible. You can just buy one in any bookshop or online. But you can also listen to the Bible on various apps. There's YouVersion, there's a whole bunch of other apps that do that. And there are different translations of the Bible for every reading level. So if you're someone you think, I'm not a great reader, there will still be a Bible that's accessible to you that you'll be able to find in bookshops. I think you read it because you want to be part of the world. You want to be part of the culture that you've either grown up in or joined or are trying to wrestle with and understand. And I think that's really important at our time in politics, where the Bible and Christianity are talked about in politics all the time, for better or worse. Do you want to understand that? You owe it to yourself in many ways to do that. I guess for me, because I encountered the Bible as a young person, I heard the story of Jesus and I was really moved by it and I believed it to be true. There's always a spiritual dimension to the reading, in my understanding, that you will hear about Jesus, a figure from history, you'll hear the stories of God's interaction with the world, and then you'll have to work out if you want to do something with that information that you've now got. So it's a bit dangerous to read the Bible because you might have to think about it and do something with it, but you emerge as someone who's a more fully formed human being and part of the culture, and hopefully your heart and soul have been touched as well.
That was Greg Clark, author of The Great Bible Swindle and former CEO of the Bible Society Australia. I think now might be a good place to step back a bit to ask some more fundamental questions about the Bible. Really fundamental. My next guest is Dr. Alexandra Robinson. She is the New Testament lecturer at the United Theological College under the banner of Charles Sturt University. She lectures in New Testament and Greek and is the right kind of person to simply ask, what is the Bible? And what are we encountering when we pick up that very large book? Here she is.
I love this question because when I first read your email, I even had to sort of stop and ponder and think, what is the Bible? This is what I do for a living. I teach the Bible. And I think the reason why you sort of have to pause and ponder that question is because it's actually not a straightforward answer, because the Bible isn't just a book that one person sat down and wrote like we would normally have with a regular book. And it's not even like it's an edited book, you know, with various chapters and things like that. It's a book that is this collection of diverse writings that came together over the course of maybe 1,500 years, something like that. So you've got maybe 40, 50, 60 writers writing at different times in history with different backgrounds. You know, you've got some shepherds in there, you've got kings, you've got prophets, you've got all these different sort of figures. And then this collection got drawn together over time. And I think what we end up with, that we now know as the Bible, really is writings and stories and narratives and poetries and songs that believers, whether they be Jewish, and I'll talk about the difference between the two in a minute, or Christians, these groups have found these writings to be useful and helpful in understanding who God is and what it means to be the people of God. And so it's sort of a collection that has emerged over time, if that makes sense.
And it comes together, particularly your area of the New Testament, which it goes together with the Jewish writings.
Yes.
What Christians call the Old Testament.
Yes.
How does the New Testament come together and become part of what we call the Bible?
Yeah, so I think in order to answer that, it would be helpful maybe to answer how the Old Testament comes together as well. So I might put the two together.
Sure,
what we now know as the Old Testament obviously was just writings, you know, when the people in the first century actually encountered and met Jesus, they just thought of these as special sacred writings. And it was sort of similar in a way. They used those writings as a way of understanding who God was, what it meant to be in relationship with God. As I said, the word testament means covenant, and a covenant, you might know, like in a marriage, it's like a binding agreement. That's what testament means. And so to them, it was this testament, this agreement that God had made with the people, right? God bound himself to the people. You know, we read in Exodus where it talks about, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, you know, have no other gods except me. And so this is the start of this binding relationship. Then when we get to this New Testament and we meet Jesus, the covenant remains the same. God wanting to have a relationship with people, a loving relationship with people, that remains the same. The way it was understood is altered a little bit as we encounter Jesus. The covenant remains true, but now we've got this kind of recapitulation of it, this new covenant, right, through Jesus. And that's what then becomes these New Testament writings. And so what we then get is we get people like Paul and Peter and these different people who actually either firsthand knew Jesus or heard about Jesus pretty soon after he rose and ascended, and they're writing about their encounter with Jesus and their encounter with the goodness of God through Jesus, and those letters then become our New Testament. And the reason they become part of the scriptures, was the issue of relevance. Did churches across an extensive period of time and space in diverse circumstances hear the word of God through a particular writing when they gathered for worship? So as they started to gather in worship, did they hear what they understood as the message of God? Who is God? What does it mean to be God's people? Was there a sense of, yes, we, just like other Christians around the world, find this letter or this writing useful in our understanding of who God is, and these are the letters that were then kind of gathered up and became our New Testament.
There's a lot of stories that swirl around that all these writings get collected together in the one place, with Constantine as the Roman emperor deciding that Christianity actually is the official religion. A lot of myths around that too. What actually goes on there?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you can sometimes think of like, oh, well, who decided? There was this council that got together and said, these are the books. And so, but I don't actually see it like that. I see it as the council almost affirming what the church had already decided.
Right. So the few hundred years leading up to that, it's come together, and this was just the point where they go, yep, these are what we agree.
Absolutely. So you've got as early as people like in the second century, there's a fellow named Justin Martyr who talks about believers coming together. This would have been about 150 CE. So we're talking about 100 years after Jesus. Believers coming together on a Sunday to worship, and they listen to the memoirs of the apostles, that would have been the Gospels, and they have the writings of the prophets read out. And so you've already got this indication there in the second century of people gathering and having both the prophets, which now we know as the Old Testament, and the memoirs of the apostle, which we now know as the New Testament, being read in their gatherings. And the reason they read them was because these were letters that, in the very early church were copied and copied and copied and circulated, and people were like, oh, this is great, you've got to read this. And then another church picked it up and found it really useful, and so they passed it on. And so it was things like these letters were written by someone who was close to Jesus, close in relationship, also close in time period, and that the theology makes sense. It's got to tie in with what we understand about who God is and what God promised in our Old Testament, in our Hebrew Bible as well. So the main thing in my mind is that the church kind of decided what was going to be in this book that we now call the Bible.
Yeah, because there were a lot of ancient Christian writings that don't make it in, right?
There's so many books called a gospel, right? We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there's the Gospel of Thomas, there's the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas. Like, there's so many of them, but these gospels didn't circulate in the same way. They weren't as helpful and edifying for the church. They just didn't have the same pull. From a very early on, I think as early as the second century, we already had, so the very first book is called a codex. It's like papyri laid flat like this and, is bound together. And we've got really early versions of these four gospels being written and circulated together around the empire. So, from pretty early on, people were saying, actually, these four are giving us this amazing idea of who Jesus was, why he came, what it was like to have Jesus among us, and what his teaching was about. And so they were gathered up by early Christians and circulated around.
Now, as you said earlier, it's written over thousands of years, many different authors. In what sense, Ali, does it make a coherent whole?
Yeah, this part, I reckon, you almost have to believe that there's something spiritual going on, right? Because it doesn't really make sense that you would have 50, 60 different writers somehow drawing together this coherent story. And you can find coherence across the whole Bible, which is amazing. Coherence around creation, coherence around, sort of these overarching stories, as I said, of covenant and love and redemption. And so there has to be something outside the Bible that helped that process, even though I don't think that all the writers of the Bible went into some sort of trance and were taken over by God and were writing these books. Right. I don't see it as that. I do think these were actual people going, oh, this was my experience of God, or as a leader of the Israelites at the time of David. This was my experience, that sort of thing. So I do think it was real people writing about their real experiences, but I think there must be something spiritual going on that was able to draw these things together. And also, particularly when we get to the New Testament, you've got Jewish people. I think that's really important. The New Testament was written predominantly by Jewish people. So it's still a Jewish text. That is important. Christianity didn't fall out of the sky. And what you've got is people like Paul and Peter and Jude and all these Jewish people saying, well, we are deeply Jewish. We understand what Judaism is. How does this Jesus now fit into that? How does my understanding of God now make sense now that I've learned that, God is three? God is Father, Son, and Spirit. It's this revisioning. Some people talk about Paul's conversion and they say, he wasn't really converted from one religion to another. He remained Jewish. But what we have here is this kind of transformation. It's this reimagining of his understanding of who God is and what Judaism is and what God was doing when he called Israel to himself. And so the New Testament then is really these writers taking what they deeply valued and understood in the Hebrew scriptures and actually quite intentionally connecting their story into that. They saw it as one story. They are a people of story, and they saw themselves as part of God's larger story.
That was Ali Robinson, New Testament lecturer at United Theological College at Charles Sturt University. Next up on our look at the Bible on Life and Faith, Dave Adamson. Dave works for YouVersion in Australia. Now, this is the most popular Bible app in the world. YouVersion is just about to celebrate the 1 billionth download of the app. It's an incredible story of growth that starts in about 2006. Dave Adamson joined us from the Sunshine Coast to tell us about the YouVersion story. I was curious to know how it all began. Here's Dave.
So it actually started in about 2006 when the app founder, Bobby Grunwald, was in a security line in Chicago. And he was thinking to himself, what if technology could change the way that people engage with the Bible? He's a very innovative thinker. And from that moment, of his own pain point that he had around engaging with scripture, he decided to create an app that might be the best way for him to solve his own problem, but also solve the problem that maybe other people were having as well about being inconsistent when it comes to reading the Bible. That was when the first idea came about. It launched in 2007 as a desktop website, only had about 20,000 visitors and zero retention, so it actually didn't work. But sometimes in the tech industry, you have to fail forward in order to find the actual solution. Yeah. What the team learned from that was that if the Bible is always in your pocket, it's more likely that engagement would become natural, because proximity drives habit formation. And so they developed an app. And when they developed that app, it was around that time in July 2008 when Apple was opening up the Apple Store for the first time, and YouVersion was ready to go. And so it was one of only 200 free apps on the launch day of the Apple App Store. And the team hoped maybe they would get like 80,000 downloads for that first year, but they actually got 83,000 downloads in the first 3 days. And the app has been growing ever since then. 17 years later, hundreds of millions of users worldwide, as you said, about to reach 1 billion. And we believe that this is still like just the beginning.
And this was at a time when no one knew what an app was, right?
Yeah.
This is very early in this story.
Very early. And that's why, 83,000 for the first year was like, that was such a pie in the sky goal, right? Because nobody really knew what would happen. But to get 83,000 after the first weekend, it was right place, right time, meeting a need that people had to engage more with God's word, but in a way that was accessible to them wherever they were, even if they were in a security line at an airport.
So it starts in the US, it spreads around the world, and it's in lots of languages, lots of translations now. From where are some of the big users? Are there some surprises in any of that?
Yeah, so obviously the US for the longest period was the biggest user of the app, but then it started to spread to other parts of North America like Canada and then to South America. And then as YouVersion started to grow the family of apps that we have, we introduced something called Bible App Lite, which is for third world countries and countries where there's not great Wi-Fi service or where data is very limited. And that app has exploded as well. So here in Australia, we actually don't have access to that app because we don't have any of those sorts of restrictions, but it's actually taken off in a huge ways in those countries. And then as we started to introduce more languages, so more Bible translations in people's language, it's over 2,000 languages now in the Bible app. It started to grow in those countries where those languages were prevalent as well. And then when it comes to Australia, we've seen dramatic increases in the way people are leveraging the app since it launched here in Australia. We've had 7.3 million installs in Australia alone. Installs are up 14% year over year, and daily use is up 12% year over year. So at the moment, there are about 200,000 Aussies who open the app every day. And the app is downloaded in 2025. The app is downloaded about once every 48 seconds here in Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because for a lot of people in Australia, they would think reading the Bible is something people once did.
Yeah.
Maybe in their grandparents' generation or something like that. They might be surprised by this. I'd love to talk to people about whether that is a surprise. Is there any way to do this? Do you get people telling you about what's going on for them when they're doing this?
Yeah, we get a lot of what we would call impact stories where people share a little bit of a testimony about how the Bible app has helped them in their specific situation. In just getting ready for this, I thought I'd have a scroll through some of the stories that we've received. And one of them that stood out for me was Grace, a woman from Perth who grew up in an atheist household until a friend recommended the YouVersion Bible app to her, and it became her lifeline to faith. She would do this daily refresh that we do where you get a verse of the day and you get a little bit of a devotion around it. You do a bit of a guided prayer thing. And what that taught her was how to reconnect to her faith. And she says that without the app, she wouldn't be a Christian today. And then there was this great story that we got shared with us from a woman named Tania. And she said that she discovered her husband was living a double life of drug addiction. And so she just opened the Bible app because it was on her phone. And she started reading through reading plans about marriage specifically. And after a little while, her husband asked her what she was doing and eventually joined her in reading those reading plans specifically about marriage and improving your marriage. And they started attending church together. And then 6 months later, the husband was baptized and overcame his addiction. And now their marriage is stronger than ever. And these are just stories that we get every single day of people connecting. And for us, what we're seeing is as more people are downloading the app, and not just downloading the app, as more people are engaging with scripture than ever before, we're seeing more and more of those stories. It's not just the app. Bible sales around the world are up dramatically for 2025. Deakin and Monash University came together in 2023, and they did a survey that showed that 85% of Australian Gen Zs report a positive view of Christians and Christianity.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it goes against the popular perception, I think, of these things. And certainly, as you say, a bit of a shift in recent years that you can detect. Yeah. And that idea of younger people, especially, trying to access the Bible app. I wonder what it is they feel like or report that they're getting from this.
Yeah, I think there's probably a whole swathe of different answers you would get if you were to ask that. But for me, this is a generation that grew up with access to the internet in the palm of their hand. And so they're regularly consuming all of this content, but what they're craving is wisdom. And so they're able to go to the Bible app, still access this in the palm of their hand, download it for free, start reading through it, and they're getting that thing that they're craving, which is that wisdom side of things. And so, I think that's a huge part of why it's starting to grow. As I said, 2025, this app is now like 17 years old, but we're seeing our best numbers in 2025. And I think this is because of the shift that we're seeing, especially post-COVID.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Ancient wisdom that is lacking for a lot of people.
Yeah, in a world that's like, everything is about AI, I think what this is revealing to me personally is that the most important AI is authentic interactions. And because we're able to provide this ancient wisdom, and because, like that story I shared, people are able to read this ancient wisdom together, they're starting to have these authentic interactions. And that's the AI that they're actually craving for.
Dave, you mentioned Bible sales are up now, and you mean by that physical Bibles?
Physical Bibles, yeah.
And yet you're talking about an app where you just get it on your phone or your iPad or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of thoughts around the physical versus the digital and the dynamic of that?
Yeah, certainly at YouVersion, we're not trying to replace the physical Bible at all. It's really a companion to the physical Bible. I mean, if you were to see me in my daily reading habits, Simon, I have a physical Bible open, probably a different couple of translations, but I also have the Bible app open just for the convenience of that. And especially in a world that's very transient, as we move around a little bit more, and as it's become such a habit for us to pick up our phone whenever there's a down second. That's where I think something like the Bible app can play a huge role, not as a replacement to the physical Bible, but as a companion to the physical Bible. And it just creates more access to that ancient wisdom that you talked about. So yeah, I think having both working side by side is the best way to do it.
Now, you've talked about making the Bible more accessible in places where it's hard to get to, but what about making it accessible in terms of approaching this very ancient, strange material and making sense of it?
One of the things I think that helps make it more accessible is the number of languages that we have, but also the number of translations that we have. So what I mean by that is not just that it's written in a different language, but it's been translated a little bit differently. And so there's modern English versions that might be a little bit more accessible to the modern reader than, say, the King James Version. So having all of those different variations of those translations make it a lot easier as well. And the great thing is they're right in the palm of your hand. It's right there. It's not like you have to buy a compendium or a library of books. You download the app once and they're all accessible to you. Plus they're available offline. And Simon, honestly, if I can, speaking just for myself, I think the best feature of it is that I can open up a translation of the Bible, hit the play button down the bottom, and I actually have the Bible read to me. For me, if I'm out walking or if I'm commuting, you're driving in my car, if I'm getting ready for work, I'm typically always listening to podcasts or I'm listening to, YouTube content, TED Talks, things like that. Well, now I can also add the scriptures to that daily routine of constantly be listening, constantly be learning as well. So I think those things help make the Bible app so accessible to the average person.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in between the times when you're on your walk and you're listening to Life and Faith, of course, religiously, Dave, you do listen to the Bible as well. And having it read to you, you're right, it's a really good way to have it. Also, I know Bible app does, in terms of accessibility and how you might approach the Bible. A lot of people might go, well, where on earth would I even start, right?
Yeah.
So it's a huge amount of material, all sorts of different kinds of material too. But Bible app gives you sort of reading plans and helps to kind of get you into it in a way that will make sense for you.
Yeah, for sure. And so we've got literally millions of reading plans available on the app. And what they are, for the listeners who aren't aware, it's like a Bible devotion. So it takes you through, maybe a story in the Bible, maybe a teaching of Jesus, maybe a book of the Bible, or, we have even read the Bible in 365 days. So you can read along with somebody who's giving their interpretation, who's giving their application and making it extremely practical as well. And those reading plans cover a range of topics. Like I said, there was a story of a woman who had issues with her marriage and started reading plans about marriage. And so from that point of view, people can access anything. And even as I look at the data of what people are searching for when they open up the app, a lot of times what they're searching for are lifestyle topics. They're not searching for, John 3:16 or a specific Bible character or a Bible story. They're often searching for things like anxiety, fear, stress. And because we can use keyword phrases as well, they're looking for things like, how do I become a better parent? how do I save my marriage? How do I stop looking at porn? Like, these are questions that they're typically asking on Google or on YouTube, but now we're finding that they're starting to open the Bible app and ask those questions in there as well. And so what we're able to do is provide them with some reading plan options that will help walk them through that step by step and unpack the scriptures a little bit more to make it more practical, so you don't have to have a theological degree in order to take wisdom out of these ancient texts. There's a theologian, there's a pastor, there's a really intellectual theological group who have written together a reading plan that helps you unpack that a little bit more.
That's Dave Adamson from the Bible app YouVersion, about to celebrate their billionth download. Let's now speak with a couple of people whose lives have been impacted by reading the Bible. Firstly, Joy Geyer, an old friend of mine who came to the Bible and to faith as an adult. Joy is the Associate Head of College at Hillcrest Christian College on the Gold Coast. After Joy, you'll hear from Johnny Wintle, who is an assistant minister or pastor and grew up the son of a minister, and so with the Bible being very familiar. Interestingly, despite coming to the Bible from very different places, they share something in terms of how they experienced it. Let's start with Joy and how she first got interested.
Well, it actually started through a friend inviting me to church and going along and meeting people. And then through that, a couple actually asked whether or not I'd be interested in going through Christianity Explained. We went and had a meal, and then we would go through a chapter of the Bible just piece by piece. And I think we started in the book of Mark.
And this was all completely new for you, right?
It was. I'd been to church as a child, like just off and on here and there, but not actually engaged in the Bible or anything like that. So, yeah, it was basically new, even though I, obviously known of church, but not been a reader of the Bible.
Am I remembering it correctly, Joy, that you would sit up in bed reading the King James Bible, trying to make sense of that? And if so, what was that like?
That's actually really funny to go back there, because I sort of had somewhat forgotten about that. I had probably started there, and in actual fact, when I go back to the journey of why I became interested in the Bible and where I started, regardless of what the version was, it was actually more about the fact that what was in the Bible and written all those thousands of years ago actually still made sense today. And for me, I actually was in that whole thing of how could this book that was written so long ago by these different people be so relevant to who I am today and what I experience. And so that's where the interest came, and I suppose that's why I pursued reading it more and finding out more.
What did you feel like you were encountering in the pages of the Bible?
Well, like I say, I actually felt like it was encountering exactly what's happening today, like humans doing life and experiencing all the things of brokenness and busyness and relationships and things going right and wrong, but having a choice of something different. And over all these years, I've actually sort of developed this whole concept of almost baggage to luggage, like all the things that happen in your life can become your greatest asset when you reshape it with what the Bible says that you can actually do with it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way you've described that. So it's like taking all the things that are going on in your life, all of which you seem to be able to relate to these characters in the Bible as well, but reshaping the way you think of those experiences, both the good ones but also the negative ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say your experiences are at some point for someone else. And I think that's what the Bible is. It's actually that era and that season and all those experiences that people had with God, with Jesus, with each other are actually then shaped for us today. And they're so relevant today. And that's why it appealed to me. And I went, there is something in this Bible that I need to find more out about. And so I've really come to, and I've had lots of experiences in my life to go, if we are open to seeing them through the lens of the Bible and what God has for us in it, we can actually reshape those, and they can actually be for someone else, but also for ourselves and who we become as well.
If you think of your life prior to encountering the Bible in any kind of depth and post that? What was the sort of shift like in that? Is there a way of describing that change?
I think the thing is, I didn't grow up in a family where we were all closely connected and, had a strong sense of extended family or anything like that. So a little bit lost potentially in identity or having that strong connections. And so what did I feel I found in the Bible? Well, I found a God who I felt had uniquely designed me for a purpose. So I found a new direction. And, like I say, there's so many experiences you have and that can shape you in a way that potentially we carry shame, hurt, pain, all those things. And so for me, coming to know Jesus and knowing that, I've been uniquely made for a purpose, but also that this is a personal experience, if you're happy for me to share it. But
Yeah, sure.
I'd lost a child during childbirth, and so had a child pass away. And the story, the gospel message and the Bible story is that God actually sacrificed his son because he loved us so much. And so for me, who has had a child pass away, I go, wow, to have a God who loves you so much that he would actually sacrifice his child, like make a choice to give his child up. For me, that's like an extraordinary thing. So that's changed my perspective to go, wow, that's unconditional love. So it's that unique design, it's that unconditional love. And it's also that hope of the future. We live in such a busy world where everyone is comparing, striving, looking for answers of what this is all about. And I just see that for me, it's actually that God's given me that real sense of comfort, peace, and regardless of the circumstances we have a hope for our future, even if that's difficult times within that.
That was Joy Geyer, now Johnny Wintle.
I remember growing up as a kid and the Bible was sort of everywhere but nowhere at the same time. It wasn't specific. There wasn't a lot of things about the Bible, but the Bible was in everything that we did, and it sort of surrounded things and encased things that we did. So I grew up incredibly familiar with it, but the familiarity, there wasn't necessarily much personal engagement. It was just sort of there, sort of in the air. But I think looking back, I remember two particular things about my experience growing up around the Bible. One was my dad forcing me and my two sisters to all read the Bible together as a family in a lounge room. I just remember the experience being really painful. Like none of us wanted to be there. And I think after a while, my dad didn't even want to be there. I don't think it lasted very long. It was like pulling teeth the whole way through. But I remember that as an experience of my family is a family that reads the Bible. I might not enjoy that all the time, but that is at least who my family is. So at least I grew up with that. And the second thing I think I remember about engaging with the Bible as a kid was that it was sort of the stories that I knew. And they were the stories that we kept coming back to. And it didn't feel like they were stories that were from a faraway place or from a distant place. They felt like our stories, like these are the stories that make who we are. And all other stories seem to be pointing to these stories. And these are the stories that govern our year and our life.
Even at that stage, when you got the compulsory reading in the lounge room, the torturous experience that was, were there any of those stories that kind of captivated you, though, as a kid?
Yeah, actually, even in that experience in the lounge room, I remember it quite clearly. Like I would have been maybe 6 or 7 years old or something, but I know what we were reading. We were reading a book in the New Testament. We were reading a book of Acts. And I particularly remember the story of Peter breaking out of jail, or being broken out of jail by an angel. Although my entire experience of reading the Bible together in that lounge feels like a negative experience, that story stands out as like a moment of wonder. Like, this is an incredible story. This is a story of deliverance, of miraculous deliverance. I mean, there's angels involved, there's chains breaking, there's people appearing through walls. I think as a kid, it's like, this is wondrous. this is fantastical, but it's being engaged with by adults who are engaging with it as if it's true and real and meaningful, rather than this is a fairy tale that we read and it's fun. This feels powerful, but at the same time, wondrous. So I remember that story sticking out to me a lot as a kid.
Now, how different then, Johnny, is your reading of the Bible today compared to when you started?
I think what's always gripped me about reading the Bible, and particularly as I've grown up reading it and study it, and it's what I do for work as a pastor, is how much even the same stories that I knew as a kid come back again and again in like fresh and expansive ways. So a story that you think on the surface seems simple, or that you could know it and you could almost recite the story, you then start reading it and you start studying it and you start noticing things that are a bit strange or a bit odd. And then if you take the time to like push into that one oddity, you find a whole universe that's right there. And you can't like exhaust the story. You keep discovering new things about it. And so I think as I've grown up, even these stories that I remember from childhood being like, oh, it's fun, I now can come back to and spend hours reading and looking and seeing how it points to other things, and a whole world opens in this one story. And that's been an incredible thing, I think, as an adult. And I think also realizing that the stories that we were reading, I mean, not only have they been powerful in shaping the world around us, but they're also just like sometimes terrifying stories. They're visceral, they're dark, sometimes they're violent, they're ambiguous at times. Like reading it as a kid, it's really clear because there's good people and there's bad people, and the stories sometimes get read into that framework. And then you engage as an adult and go, none of these distinctions or categories really fit onto the story. The story is just presented and it's left, and you have to work through it. And that's a real gift as an adult, I think, to be able to really wrestle with and work through these stories.
What have you encountered or believed to have encountered in the pages of the Bible?
I think my personal experience in reading the Bible, the one that comes to me, is an experience of comfort. There's a line in the Bible that talks about God being close to the brokenhearted. And in actually experiences of trial and suffering, the Bible has been this comfort to me. Like it's a book I take to my bed every night. Sometimes I don't always read it every night, but it's always there. And then when I wake up, I take it with me downstairs. Even the book itself has become a comfort, and then the words within it become a comfort. So I remember a particularly difficult experience myself, my family was going through. And in that time, I just took time aside to memorize Psalms, these poems and these songs in the Old Testament. And I found in those words a language that I was almost too exhausted to come up with, that it could speak those words for me. And in doing so, in speaking these words that weren't mine, I felt able to actually express myself, which was a real gift in that moment. But then also I felt myself be received by the person who I thought was sort of behind all this. I believed that God was there and was bringing me to a place of peace, bringing me to a place of comfort through these words that he himself had given to me. And so it was this sort of weird reciprocity in reading the Bible, which has sort of marked my experience, particularly in moments of tension or crisis or stress.
So how would you summarize, therefore, the way in which your life is different because of your reading of the Bible?
Firstly, my life is practically hugely impacted by the Bible. Without it, I wouldn't have a job. But without it, I also wouldn't have a community of people who gather around this book as well. So it's given me an experience of community. It's given me depth in relationship and in friends, because we have these shared stories, this shared language, this shared reference point. But then I think personally as well, I think it's what's formed my imagination the most. It is the story that all my life and all my experiences and all other stories I read seem to be pointing to and seem to be working their way back to. Like everything comes back to these stories, and they just seem to be playing themselves out again, like personally in my life, but also through the lives of others and through other stories I encounter. So it's become the dominant force behind my imagination and behind the categories by which I can understand what's happening in the world.
For the final word today, let's go back to Ali Robinson, lecturer in the New Testament. Thinking about this immense and world-shaping text, if someone picks up a Bible and they haven't really spent any time with it before, how does Ali suggest they go about reading it?
I would start with one of the Gospels, maybe Mark's Gospel. So something like Mark wasn't written down until about 60 CE. So we're talking about 30 years after Jesus. But Mark was based on these stories that had been circulating about Jesus. And so you need to sit down and think about this as this rich retelling of what it was like to actually encounter Jesus, and thinking about, why did Jesus come? Jesus came because there was something that had not been achieved through that old covenant, that first covenant that God made with the people of God. So if you think about what a covenant is, I mentioned before, this binding relationship, you've got God making a promise to the people and then saying, and now in return, I expect you to live a certain way. But we weren't able to do that. And God says, because you're not able to do that, I myself will come and do both parts of this covenant. I'll fulfill both parts. I'll fulfill my part, my faithfulness to the people, and I'll become a person and fulfill the person part that you weren't able to fulfill. So God takes that and does that. And so I would encourage people to think about it as, what is Jesus doing as he commits himself to humanity, as he comes, as he lives, as he teaches, as he dies, as he rises again, as he draws people into this good news, right? You no longer have to try and fulfill this on your own. You no longer have to do that labor. I've come and done it for you. I'm drawing you to myself. Quite literally, I've come here and drawing you to myself. And so I would think about those sorts of things: redemption, covenant, love, and this good news that all are now welcomed, right? In the Hebrew Bible, the covenant was predominantly for what we call Israel, right? The Jewish people. But now the good news is that no one's excluded. And I think in the context of, I'm a historian as my background, in the context of the Roman Empire, good news was a word they used all the time, right? They used it about emperors. Good news, a new emperor's been born, or good news, we've won this war. That good news was only for the Roman Empire. Here we've got this good news about Jesus, that God is redeeming all people, no exceptions, male, female, no matter what gender you are, no matter what ethnicity you are, no matter where you live, no matter where you sit on an economic scale. God is saying, this good news is for you. I have come to fulfill that covenant that you were not able to fulfill, and I'm going to welcome everybody in. And so all you have to do, it says in John's Gospel, is believe. That's it. That's all you got to do. Just trust, and belief is just a trust. I trust that, this Jesus was a real person. And again, from a historical point of view, you'll actually be hard pressed to find a historian that wouldn't agree Jesus was a real person, even non-Christian ones. Jesus was a real person, and these stories are going to help me to understand who he was and why he came. He wasn't just a great prophet or moral guy or someone we can just follow as a good example. He came to do something eternally significant.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Today's episode, suitably epic, included, in order, Dr. Greg Clark, Dr. Ali Robinson, Dave Adamson, Joy Geyer, and Johnny Wintle. Thanks so much to each of them. You can download the Bible app by going to the App Store. It's free. Perhaps yours will be the billionth download. And you can go to YouVersion to learn about the celebrations of that milestone that are going on around the world this month. We'll put links in the show notes to the things we've discussed today. And thanks to our producer, Alan Douthwaite. Next time.
There were really more women than men in the early Christian movement. The evidence for that is kind of overwhelming. And the attitude to women was completely revolutionary for the ancient world. I mean, Jesus himself in the Gospels tends to upend social hierarchies, and the early Christians did that as well.